Alright, so this LeetCode question is called Pascal's triangle. It says given a non-negative integer numRows, generate the first numRows of Pascal's triangle. In Pascal's triangle, each number is the sum of the two numbers directly above it. So if you take the number 2, it's the combination of 1 and 1. If you take the number 3, it's the combination of 1 and 2. If you take the number 6, it's the combination of 3 and 3. So the example is an input of 5, and what we get is a triangle made up of arrays with 5 rows, with, as we said before, each number being the sum of the two elements above it. Alright, so this is Pascal's triangle. It's just a series of numbers where each row is made up of numbers that are themselves made up of the two numbers in the row above them. So when I first try to solve this problem, I try to come up with some crazy formula, but it turns out a lot of it is just manual. And I'll show you what I mean. So let's start with the first row. With the first row, all we have to do is manually add an array with the number 1 in it. And then with every row from then on, the ones that we're seeing, they're all going to be added manually. Let me just undo all that. So with this row, what do? We manually add the number 1. Another thing to note is that the number of elements between the ones is always 1 less than the row count above it. So let's take this number 2. There is 1 element between these ones, and the row above it is row 2. 2 minus 1 is 1. Let's go to the next row. Which row is above the row with the 3's in it? It's row 3. So how many elements are in between the ones in this row? 3 minus 1, which is 2. And let's go to the final row. Which row is above this? It's row 1, 2, 3, 4. So how many elements are between the ones in this row? 4 minus 1, which is 3. All right, let me undo a bunch of that to not make it messy. Knowing that, how many elements are going to be between the ones in this row? The row above it is row 1. What's 1 minus 1? 0. So there are going to be 0 elements in between the ones in this row. So, like I said, all the ones we're seeing are manually added. So when we're done doing the calculation we just did, we just manually add a 1 at the end of this row. Now, let's go to the next row. Remember, the first thing to do is to just manually add a 1. Now, how do we get the next element? Let's see if we can find a pattern. We know the next element is going to be a combination of these two numbers. The indices of these two numbers are 0 and 1. The index for the number we need is 1. So we know that the elements that we need to add are always the elements in the row above with the indices of 1 less than the index we're on. So right now we're on index 1, so we need index 0. And the element with the same index. So the elements 0 and 1 add up to 2. Now what do? We manually add the number 1. Let's do it one more time. So new row, manually add the number 1, which has an index of 0. How many elements do we need between the two number 1's in this row? The row above it is row 3, so you subtract 1 from that, which means you need 2 elements between the ones. So we're going to need an element at index 1 and an element at index 2. And as we know now, we look at the elements in the previous row with an index 1 less than the index we're on and an index of the same index we're on. So we're on index 1, so we need indices 0 and 1. And that'll be 3. Same logic for the next one. We're at index 2. So what do we need to add up? We need to add up the index of 1, one less than we're on, and 2, which is the index we're on. What does that come out to? It also comes out to the number 3. And then finally, since we've added all the elements between the ones, we now just manually add the last number 1. So let's clean this up a bit. So this is what our array would look like so far. All right, so let's start out with what LeetCode has given us. It's a function called generate, and it accepts a variable called numRows, which represents the number of rows our Pascal's triangle needs to have. All right, let's start out this way. The way our triangle is represented is actually just an array. So that's what we're going to return at the end. What we have to do with this array is push in arrays inside of it. And each array we push in can be looked at like a row. So in the end, this is what it actually looks like, but more in the Pascal's triangle form. This array would have a row count of 2. Ignore the opening and closing brackets. All right, so now that we've said that, we'll create a new variable called triangle, and we'll make it the empty array. Next, we'll check the numRows variable that's passed in, and if it's 0, then we'll just return the triangle as it is now, which is empty. So if numRows is 0, then the triangle has no rows, so we'll just return the empty array. So return triangle. All right. Now we'll do our first manual step, which is to manually create the first row. So what we'll do is we'll say triangle dot push, and what are we pushing? The first row. The first row only has one element in it of the number 1. All right, let me do some cleanup before we move on. At this point, this is what our triangle looks like. All right, now we need a for loop to populate each row. So we'll say for let I equal 1. Usually we start at I equals 0, but we already have our 0th row, and that's just the number 1 that's represented to the left. So we'll do I is less than numRows, and then I plus plus. A pretty standard for loop. Now remember, one of the keys to solving this problem is to look at the row in front of us. So we would need a reference to that row. So let prev row equal triangle I minus 1. Right now, this is the previous row, so this is the row we're talking about. All right, and now we have to create a new row. So let new row equal an empty array. This is what we have so far. All right, now comes another manual step. Remember, we are manually adding the number 1 at the beginning and at the end of each row. So we need to add the one at the beginning. So new row dot push the number 1. So that'll be this. Now we need to populate the interior of each row. And the way we do that is with another for loop. So for let, and we'll create a variable j this time, equal 1. Why is it 1 when we usually start at 0? It's 1 because we already have an element at the 0th position of our new row. And that element is always the number 1. So now we just stop when j is less than the length of the previous row, and then we do j plus plus. Another pretty standard for loop. In the row we're on now, this loop actually isn't going to do anything. It's going to be skipped. Why is that? because j is 1, and we're saying we go until j is less than the previous row's length. The previous row's length is 1, so we can never enter this loop, and we'll only enter if j is more than 1. But we still have to populate it for future rows. So remember, we said that every element in this step is just a sum of the two elements above it. One being the one with the index 1 less than it, and one with the same index as it. So that'll look like new row dot push the previous row j minus 1 plus previous row j. So again, let's pretend real quick that the previous row was, I don't know, 1, 2, 1. The indices are 0, 1, 2. The array below it would need the indices 0, 1, 2, 3. Index 1 will be made up of index 0 and 1 above it, and index 2 would be made up of index 1 and 2 above it. So it's always the index we're on minus 1 plus the index we're on. Okay, so let's just get rid of that to make it cleaner. Okay, so now we're done with that for loop. What do we do next? This is just another manual step. We already pushed in the number 1 at the beginning, so now we have to finish it off by pushing in the 1 at the end. So new row dot push the number 1. So that'll be this. And the final step in this for loop is, even though I've drawn it so far to make it look like our array fits into the outer array, it actually hasn't so far. It's really been like this, with our array not being inside of it yet. So the final step is to push our array into the outer array. So that'll be triangle, which is the outer array, dot push the new row we just created. All right, so now that for loop would go for as many times as the rows that we've passed in. And what's the final step? It's to just return the triangle array, which would be this whole thing. Okay, let's test the code. Oh, I missed parentheses. Try it again. Looks good. Submit. Alright, so the answer was accepted. It was faster than about 19% of JavaScript submissions. As usual, the code and written description are linked down below. If you liked the video, just give it a like and subscribe to the channel. See you next time.